For a long time after the Great War, we were a peaceful Christian nation with our only intention being to spread the words of God. That what many called the Great War was indeed the second coming of Christ, which cleansed the world of sinners. Several pilgrims made their way to our land, and even those who had not heard of the word of God were invited as we teach them his ways. However, our peaceful worldview would drastically change after the Innocents' Lost Massacre. The pagans who we had invited with intentions to save and enlighten their souls fell into their own misguided beliefs and massacred a small settlement in our northern wildlands. And this made us realize that just like God did through the Great War, the only way to save a soul that has betrayed him is to kill them. This view would become even stronger once our now leader, Saint Michael, took power and transformed our previously peaceful nation into a juggernaut of military might. Such a drastic transformation was only made possible due to our high advancement in technology and science, which has occurred since we are the only nation that has steam cores, basically a boiler run on uranium, which has blessed both our industries and weaponry. However, the transformation came with a downside. Our previously united lands fell divided with 3 other Christian groups breaking away from us in the south, each believing in a different doctrine. Even in our own lands our leadership is divided. At one side stands Saint Michael, the young and charismatic prophet, and at the other is a theocratic elite. While the differences are great, the conflict has stayed peaceful as debating has been the means of battle, but this has also made it hard to solve. However, unpolitical persons in our church still exist and they are driving forward progress, like Abbot Walker and His Holiness Copper. And despite the differences, the two sides still agree a lot. For example, that our lands should be greatly developed, starting with the gate, the seat of our power. It isn't only the church that is allowing for such development, but all who live in our lands are striving together to build a tomorrow worthy of being called home. A second thing they quickly agreed upon was that the followers of the Apocalypse, a pacifist non-Christian group who had started spreading to our lands, will be discouraged to settle here to stop our people from losing their faith. And so we seized their bases, raided their supply and diverted the rest away from them. Meanwhile, the construction of our lands had continued. The Prophet's Hollow and the Steam were both rebuilt into centers of commerce and trade, which provided us with enough bottle caps to invest into the gate and greatly increase its effectiveness as a trade hub, despite our discouragement of traders and the successful rejection of the followers of the Apocalypse. We could also use it to invest into our steam pipelines who run from Heaven's Gate throughout our country and supply our settlement with the important water and warmth. However, after this we didn't continue with civilian development. We started instead developing our defensive and offensive capabilities. Because we are surrounded by heretics in the south and non-believing tribes and nations everywhere else, so we must be prepared. And so the same settlement which had been destroyed by the pagans was turned into a center of war and weapons manufacturing. We then turned to evolving our currently unofficial and disjointed militias and mercenaries who act as our army. They will be transformed into God's army that will protect and expand these lands. Despite our highly advanced technology, our guns are still outdated, and an important part of our evolution will be to bring them to the modern age. But better guns alone won't fix stuff. We need to fully reorganize our army. The 2 militias will be turned into normal infantry, and the infantry battalions will be expanded with 2 more infantry companies and 1 fire team. Our only Crusader unit, who are equipped with power armor, will also be expanded to copy the same structure as the infantry. Fortunately, we have more than enough weapons and manpower to fill this expansion. We have a lot more plans, but right now our leadership has returned to civilian expansion. We already know that we are one of the most advanced nations in the region, but our potential is so much greater as the minds of the youth are currently being wasted. So the clergy expanded their clerical education and made it available to all who wish to join it in return for prayers and finding more candidates to join. The boom in research that would follow allowed us to use our steam much more effectively and create more civilian factories. But it also had military implications. Because about 30 years ago an elderly preacher challenged the youth of our nation to reach for the skies. While it probably was a philosophical statement, many young engineers saw it as a challenge to rebuild the flying machines of old. And so we went from simple gliders to motorized biplanes and triplanes in little time. And once our engineers are able to produce safe monoplanes, we will start to equip them with guns and bombs to create the Air Force of God. During this scientific expansion, we had also continued our army expansion, equipping our soldiers with chems to stop unnecessary deaths, and we had also started training 8 more infantry battalions, because we feel how war is coming closer. And we haven't forgotten about the massacre in the innocents, and we will get our revenge, because mercy only comes to those who deserve it, not those who stand against God and try to kill him. But those who do stand against him aren't lost. They will be forgiven and then baptized in boiling water so they can travel to heaven and beg for forgiveness there. This last idea was introduced by Saint Michael, who has now grown to be far more popular than the old theocratic elite, because he has managed to spread his ideas to our population who now fully follow him. And so he has not only challenged the elites, but also fully marginalized them, as our whole population now believes what he truly is: the archangel and prophet that will lead our army against those of the devil himself. This means our leadership is no longer divided and we stand ready to face the enemies of God. However, before we attack them, we need to deal with the heretics in our south. And the first heathens are the High Chapel, who we have already prepared to face. We've successfully infiltrated them so that we know almost all information that they have access to, even their stockpile. And with this we can see that they too have prepared for war, as they have more deployed manpower than we do. However, due to their defiance of technology, we still have the upper hand, especially since our first few monoplane attacker aircrafts are being produced and deployed, which means we will have a second area of attack while they don't. In addition, our military doctrine is one of entrenchment, so they will have no chance at advancing, and if they do, we can always deploy more units. And so, confident in ourselves, we declared war. Almost immediately the heretics started attacking in all areas that weren't impassable terrain, and horrifyingly they were winning almost every battle, which forces us to send in our power armor crusaders to defend the weakest areas. However, once our small air force got into the sky, we could turn the offensives in the most western and eastern areas to losses for our enemy. Still, we had a hard time with those who strive to arrive at the bastion. But as time went on, it became more and more clear that despite the dire situation, we would hold them off. Because from the skies our growing air force made significant damage, despite some being shot down. And on the ground we were able to effectively cycle our units out and into battle, basically making us untireable. Then, after inflicting almost 3,000 casualties and with us deploying 8 more infantry units, the High Chapel was scared enough to not attack us anymore, which has allowed our power armor crusaders to withdraw from the front and start preparing their own offensive actions. After some thinking, we decided to stage it from the western tunnel with the goal of reaching the settlement called May and our forces in the southern gate. And so, with double the amount of forces in the region than they had, we started our first offensive action. After less than a year of fighting, the war has been won, because ever since we defeated their first units, they ran out of almost all types of equipment, fully halting the deployment of any more troops. And so they were reduced further and further until reaching the measly 517 persons deployed. So all we have to do now is to march into their capital, also defeating the rest of their army just for fun. And so the first out of 3 heretics have been defeated and fully annexed. To fully integrate the lands, however, will be much more difficult, as we will need to defeat the resistance and raise compliance. Fortunately, we can put our previous ideas of militias to use as garrisons, and we are providing new citizens care packages to help educate the heretics in God's true ways. During the war, we had of course focused on improving our military, for example by implementing widespread conscription, putting forth more crusaders and further developing our military industry. However, our focus wasn't only on military matters. We had also started constructing foundries to provide our nation with enough metals, and we renovated the massive ruined cathedral in the middle of Heaven's Gate to open up a new age for our country and religion. And this new age will be one without heretics, so shortly after the war with the High Chapel was over, we continued our war, now against Lords Anointed. The problem with facing them is that we have to cross a river to do so, and unlike us, they have a navy. So we didn't start the battle on the ground, but in the air, with our goal being to sink all their ships. Unfortunately, all our sorties failed, so we switched strategy to bombing their supply instead, which was far more successful. But in order to defeat their ground army, we devised a risky plan. We will retreat and let them cross the river, then cut them off to reduce their army to lower ours. Almost immediately after we retreated, they fell for the first step of our plan and crossed the river with a huge amount of forces. We then turned to part 2 and started attacking along the river to recapture the crossings. Now instead of retreating completely, they pumped in a bunch of forces, but with an overwhelming superiority in the air, their defense fell nonetheless. However, the second battle was another story, and we actually failed it, instead managing to cross the river. Unfortunately, this river crossing was short-lived, as they pushed us back over it and killed 1/4 of all our soldiers during the crossing back. However, this wasn't as big of a loss as they would face, because as we tried again, our operation succeeded and more than 20 divisions were completely encircled with no way to defend themselves. So their casualties rose up to 6,000 and their army down to 13 units. So we were now more than confident that we would be able to cross the river, and we did, which allowed us to use our strength in numbers to quickly capture their capital and spread our forces throughout their lands, with them having no way to deal with it. And thus, after capturing most of their settlements, they surrendered, and we did the same to them as we had done with the High Chapel, except we could also capture their navy to use it to train ours that we were planning to build. But we didn't wait for this navy to enter construction before continuing to the last heretics, since we won't need it as we don't have to cross the river. There are 2 small bridges, one in the north and one in the east. We declared war almost immediately after arriving to the nation, and our first attack would be on the northern bridge. We broke through almost immediately, and since they had no defense in depth, we could divide their country in 2, capturing Burley and finally entering their capital with little fighting. And so the final heretic nation has been dealt with, and we have united the lands of Christianity for the fight against the Devil's army. We will actually quickly take up arms against them, starting with the most devilish of our neighbors, the Crimson Allocates. But first we return to Heaven's Gate to look at the progress the city had made. Because for the first time since the Great War, the city is bigger than it was before it, which means we are truly growing powerful. But not only economically, but also militarily, as we have equipped our infantry with radios, something which greatly improves the efficiency of our army. So, more confident than ever, we intervened in the Timberline Crimson War.
So proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting gave proof through the night that our flag was still there.
After defeating the Crimsons, we also decided to finish what they had started by defeating the Timberline as well. Now, unlike what we did with the Heretic lands, we didn't annex all these lands, and we instead established converted states who will handle the internal issues of the regions. During these wars, we had also entered a new age, an age of complete steam superiority. And as our expansion had been so successful, the culture of war had now been fully embraced, with more than 17% of our population being willing to take up arms against the armies of hell. And this means we can already continue the fight. In the east we've succeeded, as our 3 convert states are protecting us from the Troll Warren. In the south we have no chance to expand, since it's occupied by the NCR. However, we don't need to militarily expand here, since the Republic has quite relaxed laws, allowing us to spread the word of God by mouth instead. This leaves the north with the Washington Brotherhood and the west with the Sisters of Steel. Since the Sisters are the biggest threat with their huge lands and comparable industry, we will begin by attacking them. Our current front is quite small, with only 2 regions where we can fight. The Western Tunnel in the north, which we have heavily fortified and aren't planning any offensives from, and the Territon Wastes in the south, which is a bit larger and also where we will stage our attacks. Unlike all our other opponents, they have power armor as well, since they are a part of the Brotherhood. But despite this, ours are simply way more equipped and we could break through their defenses almost immediately. We quickly swooped through Holy Valley with the constant support from our air force, but we only got 1 encirclement as the bulk of their army could retreat quite well. However, this also doomed their chances at defending Yellowstone, so we had soon reached all their mountains surrounding the area. We now have to decide if we should move north, further into the mountains, to then capitulate the Brotherhood Protectorate of Pax Americana, or move into the plains of the west. We decided to take the more difficult approach of the mountains while we wait for 20 more divisions to be deployed. While it could have been difficult, we knew how to use the mountainous terrain to our advantage and we could encircle several of their units. So their first core territory, Cloud's Heaven, was captured. We then quickly continued north until reaching Drummond, where we turned west with 1 simple goal: reaching Missoula and encircling their troops guarding the western tunnel. Not being ready at all for this risky attack, it succeeded quite quickly and we got to see many encircled units. And what's great is that many of them were their most elite troops, so they now stand fully defeated. All that is left is to reach their core lands, so much so that even their neighbors have noticed, with the Church of the Silo declaring war on them as well. So we rapidly relocated our power armor crusaders and the army in the western tunnel to Yellowstone in order to enter the plains and march northwest to their capital. It took some time to arrive, but with no units guarding it, it was easy to capture the city, and so we had won another war. We decided to annex all the mountainous states while setting up convert states in the rest of the land, except those the Church of the Silo annexed. But these don't matter, as the west is still secured enough to our liking, which leaves the northeast, the feared Washington Brotherhood. Compared to us, they have a stronger army, navy, and they will even be our first enemy with an air force, so preparations are crucial. We constructed airports, better infrastructure, and naval dockyards to build our soon-to-be-designed ships. We also deployed 40 divisions that will partially close the gap between us and the Brotherhood. And so, about a year later, we declared war, with the Brotherhood being the first to start attacking. Fortunately easily held back, with our air force doing most of the heavy lifting. Then, out of nowhere, they launched a small naval invasion all the way in Burley, with their navy even intercepting a small part of our own. We would immediately try to send in the rest to win the battle, and to hold off the ground troops we ordered our converted states in the east to send in their troops. The naval battle started with us losing our ships and quickly trying to retreat. However, our newly built ships came to the rescue and managed to turn the battle around in the last moment. Of course, our older ships were still being sunk, but we could sink theirs in revenge, and after a few hours of battles, half their fleet was at the bottom of the river. Still, the land threat existed, but by deploying our air force and destroying the port, we cut off their access to more supply, which allowed us to wear down their forces while waiting for our power armor crusaders. Once they arrived, the Brotherhood forces were easily completely destroyed, leading to us having the same amount of forces as they, as well as a huge victory in our bag. So, before they recovered, we sent our crusaders back north to reach the American coast. The first battles were difficult, but after encircling some divisions, then reaching all the way to Portland and managing to cross into its western parts, things went faster. Eventually, after some more fighting and several encirclements, everything south of the Columbia River was ours. In addition, our attack had weakened them enough that our converted states, who had now built a strong and diverse army, successfully crossed the river in the center. So we used this in order to continue our attack in the west, where we now turned north. It didn't take long for us to break through and for our crusaders to march towards Seattle. Meeting only scraps as resistance, the outskirt of the city was soon entered, with us then entering the center uncontested until finally arriving to Capitol Hill. And so, with victory within our grasps, as they are 74% towards capitulation, we launched an all-out offensive on all areas. Something which was worth it, as it granted us the crown of victory only a month later. So once again we established a bunch of converted states, but that was it. We have spread the words of God throughout the Wastelands and ensured that it is here to stay. The armies of the devil have also been crushed so many times that another innocent lost massacre will never occur again. So thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, please consider subscribing, and see you in the next video.